Now let me stress, there's a line there, but it's not based on good people versus bad people. It's based on economic reality. The reason that northern states, as I said, did not want slavery or did not need it was because, well, they didn't need it. Slavery was not essential to northern agriculture. Northern farmers really could not use, did not need slaves to carry on their work. On a northern farm, typically a grain farm, wheat, corn, what you do is you plant the seeds, you sit around for several months, and then a couple months later you go out and you harvest it. You don't need to maintain it, and harvesting is something that can be done, takes a lot of labor at harvest time, but it's only a couple weeks of the year that you're engaged in your harvest, and then you need a lot of labor, yes, but it's not worth it to invest in a slave for just a couple weeks of work. And as a matter of fact, technology by the 1830s, with the invention of the reaper and other mechanical ways of harvesting, made labor even less necessary on northern grain farms. So the North didn't need slavery, so they were okay without it. But southern agriculture required labor. And I mentioned earlier today, in the colonial days, there were 3 crops that were grown in the South that were labor intensive, that required large numbers of slaves, and those were tobacco, rice, and sugar. And then, in 1794, Eli Whitney invented the cotton gin. And then to the list of those labor-intensive agricultural products, now we can add cotton. And cotton became the great crop of the South. It could only grow in the deep South. There's an approximate line. If you look at the boundary between North Carolina and South Carolina, and then you carry that line out, and to the north of it you would have the states of Tennessee and Alabama. Tennessee and Kentucky. South of it you would have Mississippi and Alabama, and then Louisiana. You would start with Georgia, South Carolina, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and even out into Texas, although Texas was Spanish territory, Spanish and then Mexican. But that's what I referred to earlier as the Cotton Belt. And within that area, cotton was king. Now, in fact, corn remains still the major crop. But there was a lot of cotton grown, and cotton required a lot of labor. Harvesting cotton is a very intensive activity. Fortunately for cotton farmers, you can do it over a long period of time because it takes a long time. It takes weeks and weeks to get a harvest of cotton in, and you need a lot of labor during that time. You need labor to tend the cotton plants. You have to have people out there hoeing the fields much of the year. So slavery became essential to agriculture in the South. And so that's really going to why the South was so committed to slavery and why the North was not. The North didn't need slave labor, the South did. It was simply a question of economics. It was not a question of morality. It was not a question of politics. It was not a question of the North being committed to the American ideal of freedom and the South not. It was simply a matter of economic necessity. But cotton intensified and solidified what had already been true. It had always been true that the South needed more labor. With cotton, it became even more so. It became even more accentuated that the South relied on slave labor. And that took care of the whole division of the country, the fact that it was divided by geography. It was divided by the Mason-Dixon line and its extension, the Ohio River, and the country just accepted that. The North had no problem with having slavery as long as it was conducted in the South. Basically, cotton could not grow in the North, so cotton agriculture is not a threat to Northern agriculture. Northern farmers did not feel threatened by Southern slavery, because there's no way that Southern slavery is going to be established in the North, because you can't grow cotton in the North. So you're not going to have slavery in the North. There's no need for it. There's no demand for it. And Northern farmers, basically, to simplify, their grain farmers, their wheat and corn farmers, they are not threatened by cotton. So they're okay with having cotton in the South, because it doesn't hurt, doesn't bother them, it doesn't threaten them. They're not going to have to face cotton farmers coming up into the North and raising cotton and threatening their type of agriculture. So we're comfortable with that. We've worked it out. We've got the country divided, and it's divided largely on economic grounds. It's divided on reality of agriculture. There's Northern agriculture and Southern agriculture. Northern agriculture doesn't need slaves. Southern agriculture does. That's the way it is. It's a simple solution, and people live with it. People are quite comfortable with it. It's not an issue. It's not a big political problem. Then we acquired, of course, the Louisiana Territory. We purchased all of that area west of the Mississippi River. And now the question comes up eventually, what are we going to do about that? What are we going to do about that territory out there to the west? The area of the Louisiana Purchase. Now, when we bought Louisiana, when we bought the whole territory, the state of Louisiana was already settled. It had been populated by the French, and then for, a 40-year period the Spanish had it, and then the French got it again until they sold it to us. But there was a significant population of people living in Louisiana, and they were engaged in typical Southern agriculture. One of the main crops of Louisiana culture, even before the invention of the cotton gin, was sugar. And sugar is another one of those labor-intensive crops that leads slavery. So slavery was well established in Louisiana when the United States acquired the whole territory in 1803. By 1812, Louisiana was ready to become a state, but it was clearly a Southern state. It was a slave state, but it was a slave state based on, as of 1812, based on sugar. Cotton was just starting to come into its own. The cotton gin has been around for a couple of years, and Southern agriculture is starting to be taken over by cotton. But there's no question that Louisiana is going to be a slave state. So when it was admitted to the Union in 1812, it was admitted as a slave state. That's not an issue. That was not a problem. Other states west of the Mississippi are becoming admitted to the Union, and the northern ones are becoming in as non-slave states. The southern ones are coming in as slave states. So that's the way it's settled. Now we're ready to take up the question of the area west of the Mississippi, except for the state of Louisiana itself, which was sort of a non-issue. And the question came up in the case of Missouri around 1820. Now, if you look at a map, you see where the Ohio River runs into the Mississippi, and if you look at that map, you'll see that Missouri is basically north of the line of the Ohio River. The Ohio River does not run into Missouri, of course, but if you just look at a map, you'll see that where the Ohio River comes down, runs into the Mississippi, and then on the other side of the Mississippi, Missouri is there, but most of Missouri is essentially north of the Ohio River. So that means that for most purposes, Missouri is a northern state. It's north of the line that had been settled previously. And most of Missouri is off limits to cotton production. In most of Missouri, it's not possible to grow cotton. It's both geographically and in terms of its basic topography and its climate, it's a northern state. So it's a non-cotton state, and that would mean it would be a non-slave state. It would appear to be simple, both in terms of extending the line and in terms of the fact that you're not going to be growing cotton in Missouri. And the whole question of slavery is becoming more and more tied up with the issue of cotton. And since there's not going to be cotton in Missouri, there's not going to be slavery in Missouri. But in the very southeastern corner of Missouri, just a little tiny area down there, it's sometimes called the Boot Heel, because if you look at a map, there's that little tiny chunk of Missouri that goes down south of the rest of the state. And in that little southeastern corner, slavery did exist. Cotton does grow there. That's like the northern edge of the geographic area where cotton can grow. You need a long growing season. You'll get it right there in the southeast, but just in the southeastern part of the state, very small part geographically. In terms of the area of the state, it's a small part of it. But it's just warm enough there, the growing season is just long enough that you can grow cotton there. And so there were a relatively small number of cotton plantations in the southeastern corner of the state. Not by a fourth, it's a little tiny part. As the territory of Missouri was going through the process of getting ready for statehood and submitting their request to Congress to be admitted to the Union as a state, the politics of the soon-to-be state of Missouri were a little distorted. That although in terms of area, the southeast, the cotton part of Missouri is a small part of the state. In terms of the population, it's a small part of the population. But politically, that little slave-owning small community in the southeast dominated the state. And when they drafted, when Missouri drafted its state constitution in 1820, they included legalization of slavery. This was a concession to the cotton growing area of the state, which is a small part of the state, but which politically has the power. So now Missouri has asked to be a state. By all definitions, it's a northern state, but it wants to be a slave state. That's not the pattern. We have a pattern. We've got things worked out. This is out of that pattern. This is to have a northern state, which is going to be mostly a non-cotton state. It's mostly going to be a standard northern state with grain farmers, corn. It's going to be like other northern states. It's mostly going to be a corn or wheat growing area of the state, other grains, barley, whatever. But it wants to come into the Union as a slave state. The application of Missouri to become a state with slavery set off a huge political dispute in Congress. This was a very intense, very serious, very emotional debate over whether Missouri should be accepted as a slave state. And again, I want to stress, this is not a question of morality. This is not that Northerners are somehow anti-slavery or they're more committed to freedom, they're more committed to the American ideals that all men are created equal. It's not that. It's just a matter of economics. I think you understand the southern position. They're going to be growing cotton in a small part of Missouri, and so they want to have slavery in that small part. So the state constitution has to legalize slavery. And so that's what the South is after. They're after being able to continue to grow cotton in Missouri. But for farmers of the North, the threat of having a slave state in Missouri, having Missouri as a slave state, was a threat to their whole way of life. Their fear was that if Missouri became a slave state, that slavery would be used not for growing cotton, or not just growing cotton, which for Northerners, that's fine. They don't care about that. As long as you're only going to grow cotton, we don't care. You're only going to grow cotton in Alabama and Mississippi, you can have slavery there because they're cotton states and we're not cotton states, so we don't care. They're not going to be rivals to us. But the fear was that slave owners would bring slaves into Missouri and use them not just for growing cotton, but also use slaves for growing other types of agricultural products. In other words, slavery would become a competitor to the free farmers of the North. They were afraid that Southern farmers would start using slave labor in Missouri to raise products other than cotton. Most of Missouri is outside of the cotton belt, but that people would be using slaves in Missouri in competition with them. And the fear was that slave labor would enable farmers to produce wheat, corn at a lower price. It would cost less to grow it. They would be able to sell their wheat and corn on the market, on the open market, the world market even, at a lower price, and this would lower the income of Northern farmers. One of the great issues in American history was their fear justified? We don't know that, and we don't have any way to find that out. My own judgment on this is that in fact the fear was not warranted. I don't think that Southern farmers would have been able to justify the use of slaves for the production of things like wheat. Wheat is not like cotton. Wheat doesn't require intense labor. That farmers growing wheat in Missouri would not have been able to use slaves, because the slave would have cost them so much money, and there would have been not much use for it, and it would have just not been economically viable. So I don't think that it was a fear, that it was a rational fear, but it was a fear. And Northerners did not want slavery in the North because they feared it would compete with them. They feared that slave labor would lower the price of wheat, that they would lose their farms, they couldn't compete, they would lose their farms, Southerners would take them over, they would become slave farms, and maybe the white farmers themselves would end up being the slaves. So there was intense opposition to allowing slavery into Missouri.